This morning, the most watched congressional race in North Texas. Jasmine Crockett, Jane Hamilton, both taking our questions about a fresh start they say they would give one of Dallas's most economically disadvantaged areas. Can a pro-life congressman remain in the Democratic Party? Henry Cuellar is going to find out 2 weeks from Tuesday. We've heard the speculation that overturning abortion might galvanize voters, but in which political party? Something we'll discuss on the roundtable. And Texas's population boom is creating backlash. A majority of Texans say the state is now headed in the wrong direction, but the voters surveyed are not placing political blame.
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
Good Sunday morning to our viewers across the state. Election results from last night already tallied in most Texas counties, and you can check those here on the station's website. But let's get to the other political headlines happening here in Texas. A new poll out the other day showed that Texans are fed up with all the population growth. This is a first, and it surprised the pollsters at the UT Austin Politics Project. A majority of Texans surveyed say the state is headed in the wrong direction, and they thought the state's dramatic population growth is bad for Texas. Republicans have successfully grown this state with new business over the last 20 years. Still, that same poll shows Greg Abbott remains 11 points ahead of Beto O'Rourke. Do Democrats have room in their party for a pro-lifer? Congressman Henry Cuellar is a pro-life Democrat running for re-election in South Texas in a tight runoff later this month with a progressive named Jessica Cisneros there. She called on Democratic leaders in the House to rescind their support for Cuellar in light of this. And a team of medical and legal researchers say Attorney General Ken Paxton's opinion on trans children was filled with false claims. This is Paxton's opinion from February that led Governor Abbott to have the state open child abuse investigations into families who give their child gender-affirming care. The researchers from Yale and UT Southwestern say that Paxton's claims were not grounded in reputable science and are full of errors. Both of those teams said the AG opinion was likely motivated by bias. This morning, we are focusing on the most watched congressional race here in North Texas. Jasmine Crockett versus Jane Hamilton. Election day is 2 weeks from Tuesday. Both women want to succeed the retiring Eddie Bernice Johnson, who has held this seat since 1992. The congressional seat is District 30. It's drawn for Democrats and makes up most of southern Dallas County and some of Tarrant. This morning, both candidates on the program with us, beginning alphabetically with Jasmine Crockett. Representative Crockett, let's start with the elephant in the room. For years, there has not been enough investment in Congressional District 30. You say you're passionate about inequities. What in the world can you do to bring parity to so many people who have had, economic issues for decades?
Yeah, one of the things that we need in representation is someone who will speak up and speak out and make sure that these inequities are on the forefront of the conversation. A lot of times we just don't even talk about it. It's just presumed that everyone understands this, and that's not true. So number one, speaking up and speaking out. Number two, having legislative experience. I'm in a position to be able to write legislation that I know will provide for some sort of equity in our district. And number three, I think that this is about public service. I keep saying that. I'm a public servant first. I'm not really big on politics and things like that, but what I am big on is fighting for the people. That means that outside of legislation, I've got to go and talk to the corporations that are located right here. I've got to even talk to other corporations and try to woo them to Texas and make sure that when you come to Texas, you're investing in District 30.
In her 30 years in Congress, the incumbent Eddie Bernice Johnson, she really focused on transportation. Yeah. DART, Dallas Area Rapid Transit, among others. What would your focus be if elected?
I don't think it'll be transportation, while I completely agree that it's absolutely necessary. And I know that we still have our issues with DART in the city of Dallas. I think I've got to focus on what I consider to be the existential crisis that we're facing right now. We just saw what happened with the Supreme Court. It seems as if we are losing more rights than gaining. Right now, what we've got to do is get back to basics. We've got to make sure that we protect our democracy. We've got to make sure that things such as Roe v. Wade aren't going to go away, or the Loving case isn't going to go away, or that we don't have to worry about people that decide that they want to marry who they love, whether they're the same sex or not. We've got to make sure that our basic principles are covered. And right now, I'm very concerned that our very democracy is crumbling before our eyes.
Well, let me ask you about Roe v. Wade. I mean, it's an issue out there, and we saw what happened with that. In your view, does Congress actually have any options to protect a woman's right?
Absolutely. We need to codify it. It should have been codified a long time ago.
But as divided as Congress is, do you think something like that could actually pass?
I don't know. I will tell you this. When I was down in the House, I was surprised at the number of Republicans that seemingly did not really care for the bill that passed here in the state of Texas. Now, they voted for it because they had elections coming up, but there were definitely some Republicans that were uneasy.
That's the heartbeat bill, right?
This is the heartbeat bill. And so when you think about how extreme it is to say, hey, we're just going to get rid of 50-year-old precedents, I think that there are some people that are uneasy about that. Well, people know what happens when I'm in the driver's seat. They know that I don't pretend like I'm going to speak up, but they know that I have spoken up. They know that I risk my very freedom because I believe that much in democracy in the state of Texas. I had a warrant out for my arrest, and that didn't matter to me because what mattered is that people wouldn't be disenfranchised, and they were.
And that was in D.C.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there was nothing else that happened. That was in D.C. The warrant was issued by the Speaker of the House.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
And so having experience is what we need, especially in this time. We can't afford to take a risk on someone who says, I was a staffer or I worked on campaigns. I've worked on a ton of campaigns, but that's not my qualifications for running for office. I mean, you don't normally see somebody say, well, I worked on President Joe Biden's campaign, so now I should be president because I'm qualified. It just doesn't translate.
I moderated a forum the other night, and one of the things that came up a couple of times is that you've been a state rep for a year and a half, and they pointed out that you haven't opened a district office. I found that hard to believe, and I went and looked on the state website, and I didn't see an address. Why not?
Absolutely. So I'm so happy that you asked this question. Most people didn't come in the midst of COVID. My district director is over 70 years old. So while we were down in Austin, I absolutely did not want to risk his life and his safety. In addition to that, it was just a decision that I made in the midst of COVID, even for my constituents. Now, whatever work constituents have needed, we have definitely supplied. That's exactly why I had no problem winning over HD 100 when it came to the CD 30 race. Now, I will also tell you this. Most people don't realize that our budget is only $13,000 a month. That is to pay for your office, that is to pay for your staff, that is to pay for your mailings, that is to pay for everything. $13,000 a month is all we get. So it's not a matter as if it just pops up. You actually have to budget for it. So we actually have it in the budget. We actually have a lease. It's just that my opponent doesn't know because we haven't done our ribbon cutting.
Are you going to do that?
We will, most likely after this election is over. Because of some of the things that go on, I definitely didn't want there to be any confusion about what that office was. But we have an office, and I'm sure people will be excited to see exactly where it's located.
Representative, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
We'll get to Jane Hamilton in just a moment, but we do want to discuss that bombshell last week, the leaked draft of a Supreme Court opinion, which looks like it might overturn Roe versus Wade. Candidates from both parties are already fundraising off of it over the last few days. But will that leak from the Supreme Court galvanize Democrats or Republicans? Ayan Mitra is the senior managing editor at the Texas Tribune in Austin. Ayan, always good to see you. At the end of the day, is this likely to get more people to show up and vote for which party?
Well, it's certainly got people talking, and it's certainly got a lot of the messaging has changed now in campaigns. I think it's very clear ahead of the May 24th runoffs that candidates are really kind of focusing on this issue, and it's really turning up. And I think a lot of people are also watching to see the endorsements in these races too, as it kind of fleshes out in terms of like who how people are landing on this issue. But it's certainly going to dominate the discourse.
Yeah, it sounds like it, along with inflation too, I'm sure. Let's talk about the school board races that happened on Saturday across the state. These are no longer sleepy races with low turnout, huh?
No, and there's a lot of attention, and there's a big money coming in. The Tribune reported a story recently about how a company kind of invested about $500,000 in a political action committee that were backing some conservative candidates in several Tarrant County school board races. And, the debate, whether it's over, so-called critical race theory or the issue about like which books should be allowed in libraries, on school libraries, has really dominated a lot of the conversation and has brought a lot of attention to these races.
Yeah, and will so for the near future, I'm sure. I am back to you in just a moment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Coming up next, Jane Hamilton. She is in the Democratic runoff for Congress this month, hoping to represent a massive part of North Texas. But how is Hamilton fundamentally different from her opponent? We will ask her. And a poll from UT Austin shows that most Texas voters support allowing abortion in some form. Will that affect turnout or Texas politics post-Roe? We'll get into that on the roundtable. And while the world worked from home over the past 2 years, downtown Dallas did something different. It put parks over parking lots. A public-private partnership is behind the greening of downtown Dallas. It's a fascinating urban revival story and the focus of this week's Y'all-itics podcast. Download this episode this morning wherever you get your podcast. Welcome back to Inside Texas Politics. Let's pick back up now with our coverage of Congressional District 30 in North Texas. This seat is coming open after 30 years as Eddie Bernice Johnson retires. 800,000 people in a massive swath of Dallas and Tarrant County. It's drawn for Democrats, and Jane Hamilton is also in the runoff for it 2 weeks from Tuesday. Ms. Hamilton, welcome to the program here. Let's start with a basic question. You're running against Jasmine Crockett. How are you two most different?
Experience, results, and integrity. You know, I have been serving North Texas families since 2000, believe it or not. My birthday was April 28th, and I've been doing electoral politics, policy work now for 23 years. In this race, I'm the only person that has actually worked in Congress, having worked for the House Rules Committee, as well as being the Chief of Staff to Congressman Vesey. And also, I would say, delivering results, things that really matter to people right here in Congressional District 30.
Let me ask you about CD 30. Housing costs are up everywhere. Food costs are up. Gasoline costs are up as well, too. What is the federal role in trying to achieve parity in the district?
First of all, we got to get people back to work. You know, we talk about the need for testing. We talk about the need for vaccinations. And what we saw coming out of this pandemic is that we really do have to get people back to work. That is paramount that happens, and that is where public health comes in and making sure that people are vaccinated, they have the resource, they know where to go get tested, they know how to get vaccinations. And in CD 30, we are still having to make sure that people know where to go to actually be vaccinated.
But aren't there, I mean, there are a record number of job openings right now. We just saw the other day. Why aren't people taking some of these?
Well, we also know inflation is an issue, right? So once people had that period where they weren't going to work, they were figuring out exactly how to make it through. And now that they've had that break and we see gas prices rising and cost of food, going to the grocery store, we have got to get back to the point in this country where we are making things in the United States of America, and Congressional District 30 is ready. We are ready for those jobs, those manufacturing jobs. We know that 74% of computer chips are made in East Asia. We would like some of those jobs here.
If elected, how would you bring those jobs here?
I would work on the manufacturing side of things, making sure that I'm working with my colleagues, making sure I'm working with the administration. Biden has a plan to bring those manufacturing jobs back to the United States, and I would be on the front line of fighting to make sure that those jobs come to Congressional District 30.
One other issue with CD 30 that everyone knows is the lack of economic progress for decades upon decades. One question is, why is that, do you think? And number two, if elected to Congress, how could you bring federal help to CD 30 to improve that?
You're absolutely right. What we know in particular, you know, while this district, we do pull in some of Tarrant County, Grand Prairie, and a little of Arlington, we know that Dallas ranks one of the lowest cities for economic mobility. That's a problem. What can we do about it? We have $27 billion coming into Texas for infrastructure. We have got to make sure that we are working across the aisle, that we are working with our state officials. You know, I have great relationships with some of the people who have endorsed me, like State Senator Royce West and Chris Turner and Rafael Anchia. But we have to make sure that the federal legislative elected officials as well as the state officials are working together to make sure that that federal money, those federal resources, when we talk about those infrastructure dollars, actually get to the communities like Oak Cliff, like South Dallas. We are not only job seekers, but we are also job creators.
Jane, you mentioned endorsements. You were endorsed by DMFI, the Democratic Majority for Israel. Some in that group, as you probably know by now, have faced criticism for being anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim. Why did you seek out that endorsement? I
actually didn't seek that endorsement, and I'm thankful that you asked about that. They called me, we had a conversation, and I said, listen, I am for a two-state solution, and I think that right now in this country, we need to be talking more about a two-state solution. We need to press on Palestinian Authority and frankly Israel so that we can come together and have this conversation. We don't even talk about it anymore. And they decided to endorse me. Now, what is concerning is that in this race, when we talk about people who come into a race that are national organizations, we know that Sam Bankman-Fried has put in $2.3 million, which is a super PAC, into this race for my opponent Crockett. And it's all about cryptocurrency. And as Democrats, we tend to say in Citizens United, right? And so I really tell people that we have to watch labels because, you know, my opponent has been endorsed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. She's the Our Revolution candidate. And so what we know about that is that supposedly they are not for super PACs. So I tell people all the time, you know, voters to just be careful with labels that people put out there, whether they're progressive or moderate, because in this race, what we are seeing is a very high level of hypocrisy.
Ms. Hamilton, thank you for the time.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, most Texas voters support allowing abortion in some form. At least that's what a poll said last week. So why isn't that reflected in state politics? We'll get into that next on the Roundtable.
This is Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley.
Time now to put the headlines in perspective. Ian Mitra is back with us, the senior managing editor of the Texas Tribune. Bud Kennedy is here each week from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and Bernadine Steptoe is a political producer at WFAA in Dallas. Ian, let's start with you. And this leak from the Supreme Court has a lot of people talking. Obviously, it's the big political news of the week. One interesting thing in all this, especially in Texas, is Henry Cuellar, the congressman from South Texas. He is a pro-lifer. The question is there room in the Democratic Party for a pro-lifer?
Well, I mean, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has said that she's supporting all candidates right to left within the framework of the Democratic Party. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Cisneros was, even before this leak, was kind of campaigning on Representative Cuellar, Congressman Cuellar's stance on this issue. So this, even before this leak came out, this was already an issue in the campaign.
Bud, do you think Cuellar survives with this? And does it affect the Attorney General's race in this state?
Well, of course, it's a lot better for the district to have his incumbent standing and have his experience in role in Congress. This is an example of the problem the Democrats face in South Texas. You know, can a pro-life Democrat, and by the way, Cuellar supports choice in the event of rape, incest, to save the life of the mother. So he has exceptions. Can the Democrats support that? I think so.
Yeah, and of course, Bernadine, a lot of the constituency there in South Texas is Latino, and a lot of them are conservative Democrats who also support this issue.
Absolutely. And I think that he will survive because I think that the Democratic ticket, the Democratic tent is large enough that it can include different stances and different issues. So I think that he will survive.
Let's stick with abortion because, you know, last week in the middle of all this, too, we got a new poll from the UT Austin Politics Project, and the poll showed that most Texas voters support allowing abortion in some form. That same poll also showed that Governor Abbott is 11 points ahead of Democratic challenger Beto O'Rourke, so they don't seem to be holding political blame anywhere.
Yeah, I think, you know, the pollsters at UT have talked about kind of how these numbers related to abortion have been relatively consistent. And in terms of like kind of how it moves forward for here, it'll be interesting. The pollsters are very interested too, to kind of see like how things change, because these surveys have always been done with the framework of Roe v. Wade. And now if that is overturned, I think that could shift some of these poll numbers that we're seeing.
So why isn't this reflected in state politics at all then, Bud?
Well, you know, more than half of the Republicans in Texas who vote are over 65. Abortion is not a primary issue. It's not the number one issue to a lot of Texas voters. We see over and over immigration right now. The border is the number one issue. It just hasn't caught enough attention for Democrats to get busy and vote. Republicans still dominate, and Republicans vote for candidates who are pro-life. That's become the political carrot that's held out there by every candidate, saying we're going to get a little bit more pro-life this session. You wait and see.
So these folks in the poll, Bud, are answering the survey question, but they're not going out to vote, it sounds like.
It's not their number one issue, and they're not going out to vote. And the young people, if they answer the poll, they're not showing up to vote at all.
Bernadine, what do you think about this?
I think Bud is absolutely right. I think that you have other issues, and this issue has not gotten enough attention yet. But I think that you have issues, and as the poll showed, that the biggest issue in Texas is immigration and protecting the border. And a lot of the Republican voters vote for those issues. But however, I think that at this point, there are so many other issues. You have inflation, you have the gas prices. There are so many other issues at this point in this election that they're not focusing on that at this point.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, perhaps, but right now, there are so many other issues. And
to Bernadine's point there, I mean, there are so many issues that are driving Texas voters here. Inflation is, people vote with their pocketbook all the time. Will abortion be one of those issues that gets people out at all?
I mean, it'll be something that'll be talked about too, but ultimately I think, it's going to be, we have an unpopular president in tech as far as Texas is concerned, in terms because of the inflation, as you mentioned, and people are going to end up kind of voting, from their pocketbook quite often. So I think that's going to be, where things stand with inflation, with the economy. That's going to be the biggest driving force.
All right. I and Bud, Bernadine, thank you very much. We always appreciate it. Thank you for watching as well. We're back again next Sunday to take you inside Texas politics, and hope you can join us then. Until next Sunday, hope you have a great week.